Hey guys, today I'm going to talk to you about quadrilaterals. You should have been watching some videos and maybe doing some Google forms on the different types of quadrilaterals, but I'm going to give you my short compacted lesson, okay? So as you've learned by now, a quadrilateral is any closed figure with four sides, okay? So as long as the shape has four sides and it's closed, meaning that there are no openings, it's considered a quadrilateral. What I mean by an opening is like this. Okay, so yes, technically this has four sides, but there's an opening here. And the way I always say to think about it is pretend you have your cute little puppy. You got your new little puppy, okay? And I know it's the cutest little puppy. He's in your yard, okay? If you have a choice between putting him in a yard that looks like this and a yard that looks like this, well, which one are you gonna choose? Hopefully you're gonna choose this guy because it's closed, okay? So a closed figure just means that it's closed. You can put your little puppy in it and he'll be safe. He won't run away, he won't escape, okay? So any closed flat 2D, not 3D, we're not talking about spheres and cubes, okay? Any closed flat figure with four sides is called a quadrilateral. It can be as crazy looking as you want it to be, okay? It doesn't have to look like a pretty diamond or a nice little square. I mean, it can be wonky, donkey, whatever, okay? If it has four sides and it's closed, it's a quadrilateral. That's all it takes. So it doesn't take much to be a quadrilateral, okay? Now what you'll see on the poster behind me is what we call the quadrilateral hierarchy, which just means up here at the top is kind of the easiest thing to be. It has the least requirements. And then as we go down, it gets harder and harder to meet those requirements, okay? So in order to be a quadrilateral, all you have to have is four sides and be a closed figure. Now, once you've determined that a shape is a quadrilateral, you kind of have two things you need to ask yourself. One is, are there any parallel lines, any sets of parallel lines? So a parallel line just means that they're across from each other, and if you extend them out, can they go on and on forever and ever without touching? And in this case, this set of lines can, okay? They're opposite, they can go on and on forever without touching. So we know that this shape, which I've already labeled as a parallelogram, does have at least one set of parallel lines. Now I'm going to check the other sides, okay? If I do the same things to the other side and I extend the line on and on forever, it's going to be the same thing. They're going to go on forever and ever, and they're never going to cross. They're never going to run into each other. They're just going to go forever and ever and never touch. So in this case, this has two sets of parallel lines, okay? So if you are looking at a shape and it has two sets of parallel lines, then you know not only is it a quadrilateral, but it's also a parallelogram, okay? Now, if you get to a shape and you do the parallel line trick and you say, okay, let's see, top and bottom, are these lines gonna go? I always like to just kind of extend it. It gives me a better idea of if they're ever gonna touch. So in this case, yes, they are parallel because they're never gonna touch. So now I'm gonna try the side by sides. I did the top and the bottom. I'm gonna try the side by sides. Now, you'll notice with these lines, and it's hard to see because I wrote the word trapezoid, but if I keep going up here with my purple, and I keep going up here with my purple, what happens eventually is they touch, they cross. So in this case, these are not parallel lines. What that means is that a trapezoid only has one set of parallel lines, okay? So once you've decided that something is a quadrilateral, it's got four sides and it's closed, then you need to look at the sides. If there's one set of parallel sides, then you know it's a trapezoid and you can stop right there. If there are two sets of parallel sides, then you know it's a parallelogram and you're going to want to keep going. So a parallelogram is any quadrilateral that has two sets of parallel lines. So it's not quite that hard to be a parallelogram either. Notice that after you've decided something is a parallelogram, then you need to look and see, are there any right angles? Okay, let's say that I go down here. I know this is a parallelogram. Now I'm going to come down here, I'm going to look at this shape. This also has, looks to be, two sets of parallel lines. Okay. What I notice about this shape is that all of the sides are equal. So not only does a rhombus have two sets of parallel lines, but the sides are equal. Okay? When I say equal, it means there's equal in length. Another word for that is congruent, which means the same. Okay? But what a rhombus doesn't have are right angles. When I try to make an L here, it doesn't work. I've got a bunch. These are acute angles, and these are obtuse angles. So there are no right angles. So a rhombus is two sets of parallel lines. The sides are equal, but there are no right angles. And once you discover that, then you can stop right there. Okay? Now, if you're looking at a parallelogram that has two sets of parallel lines, and you say, hey, this does have right angles, then you know you're going to kind of go down this road. So right angles, you should have learned about in fourth grade, are just 90 degrees. A lot of times you'll see them just drawn as these little boxes in the corner. Whenever those little boxes are drawn in the corner, it's just a way of showing you that it is a right angle. So a lot of times on like a test or a worksheet or a textbook, it will draw that little, make a square in the corner, and that just shows you this is a 90-degree angle. Anytime, do you hear that? Anytime you have four right angles, then you know your quadrilateral is either a rectangle or a square. Rectangles and squares are the only quadrilaterals that have four right angles, okay? Now sometimes you'll have something called a right trapezoid, and there will be one right angle, but because there's only one set of parallel lines, it's not a rectangle or a square. So it's still a type of trapezoid, just one of the angles is a right angle. So sometimes you will see that. Okay, back to the rectangle. Now rectangle and square are two shapes that you learned early on, maybe like preschool, kindergarten, okay? You have known about rectangles and squares for a very long time. But for some reason, these are the two shapes that get us confused the most. So I want you to make sure that you're listening. I know this video is going a little long, but this is a whole 2 weeks of teaching in one video. So bear with me, okay? So a rectangle has two sets of parallel lines. Okay. A rectangle also has opposite sides that are congruent, meaning the top and bottom are congruent and the sides are congruent. So sometimes they're longer, shorter, whatever. In this case, my top and my bottom are longer, my sides are shorter. But as long as the opposite sides are congruent, then I'm good. So opposite sides congruent, not all four sides congruent, just opposite. Two sets of parallel lines, opposite sides congruent, and four right angles. Okay, now I'm running out of room on my paper here. I really need like my big whiteboard, but I don't have it. So again, we're making this work, bear with me. Now, if we have opposite sides that are congruent, we can keep going. And the hardest thing of all the quadrilaterals, the hardest thing to be is a square. The square is like the king, okay? King quadrilateral. So the square is the hardest thing to be. You have to meet a lot of qualifications to be the square. Everyone cannot be a square. They just can't, okay? Squares have 4 congruent sides, which means all of the sides are exactly equal. I'm going to use my pink pen so you can see the difference. 4 congruent or equal sides. The other thing that a square has, of course, are 4 right angles and 2 sets of parallel lines. We know that because we already said it was a parallelogram. I'm going to write PL for parallel lines because I'm out of space, so sorry about it. Okay, so what you'll see here is that a square is the hardest to be. But once something becomes a square, it gets to be a lot of other things too. And this is where we get the most confused. So once you've determined that something is a square, you can kind of follow the lines backwards all the way up. So a square is also a rectangle. It is also a parallelogram, and it is also a quadrilateral. So a square is a rectangle, a parallelogram, and a quadrilateral. Now, a lot of times people will say, give the most specific answer. So if it asks you to give the most specific answer, that means it wants you to go as far down the quadrilateral hierarchy as you can go. So if the furthest you can go is to say it's a parallelogram, stop there, okay? If the furthest you can go is to say it's a trapezoid, you stop there. But if it's a square and you can go all the way down, then you always want to say it's a square. So I'm going to leave you with a word of advice because this is where we get the most confused every year. A square is also a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square. Okay, I'm going to say it again because it's important. A square is also a rectangle. A rectangle is not always a square. It is not always a square. Boys and girls, you got to use your preschool knowledge for this. If it looks like this, you know it's not a square. You knew it when you were 4 years old that wasn't a square, right? So a rectangle is not always a square, but a square is always a rectangle. Got it? Okay. I am so glad that you hung in there with me this long. And this has been my longest video yet, but I miss teaching and I miss you guys. And you know I love to teach math. So, bye. I'll see you soon.